There is a version of the First World War that most people carry around in their heads. It involves mud and wire and young men going over the top at dawn. It involves poets and letters home and generals making bad decisions from safe distances. It involves a beginning, a middle, and an end. It involves the idea that something was learned. That version is not wrong in its details. It is wrong in its atmosphere. It communicates tragedy, as though tragedy were the exception, as though the men who passed through those years were simply unlucky, victims of a war that got out of hand, unfortunate participants in a catastrophe that nobody planned and nobody maintained and nobody chose to continue. That version leaves out the most important fact of all. The suffering was not accidental. It was administered. It was budgeted. It was organized into schedules, logistics chains, field manuals, and medical protocols. The death tolls were not the result of chaos. They were the result of systems working exactly as designed. This video is about those systems, not the explosions, not the famous last letters. The systems. World War I did not begin with trenches. It began with movement, with cavalry and supply columns, and the belief held almost universally by military planners on every side that the war would be over in months. The German Schlieffen Plan was built on speed. The French Plan 17th was built on offensive spirit. The British Expeditionary Force was small and professional and expected to operate in open country against an enemy in formation. None of those things survived contact with modern firepower. Within weeks of the first major engagements in the late summer of 1914, something became clear to the men on the ground, even if the generals were slow to acknowledge it. Men crossing open ground in the face of machine guns and quick-firing artillery did not advance. They died, in enormous numbers, in very short amounts of time. And so both sides did the only rational thing available to them: they dug. They dug because the ground was the only protection that existed in sufficient supply. They dug because staying above the surface meant dying. They dug because armies cannot function if everyone is dead. And by the autumn of 1914, a line of earthworks stretched from the English Channel in the north to the Swiss border in the south, roughly 450 miles. It would stay approximately where it was for the next 4 years. The trench itself, taken as a physical object, was not what most people picture. The image of a simple straight ditch, men standing in a line looking forward, does not capture what the trench system became. The Western Front was not one trench. It was a complex, layered network of positions that in fully developed sectors stretched back several miles. There was the fire trench at the front, closest to the enemy. Behind that, connected by communication trenches running at angles to prevent enfilading fire, were support trenches. Behind those were reserve trenches, then supply routes, artillery positions, command posts, medical facilities, rest billets in ruined villages. The system in its most elaborate form resembled a city that had been turned 90 degrees and buried in the earth, with all its infrastructure running horizontally underground instead of standing vertically above it. The men who lived in this system did not do so under the conditions that a modern person could comfortably imagine. The trenches were not dry. They were almost never dry. The ground in much of Belgium and northern France sits on clay, and clay does not drain. Rainwater pooled in the bottom of the trenches. Groundwater seeped in through the walls. Sumps were dug to collect it. Pumps ran constantly where they were available. In the worst sectors, particularly around Ypres, men stood in water for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Their feet, enclosed in boots that were never fully dry, began to deteriorate. The tissue between and beneath the toes softened. Blood circulation failed. Sensation disappeared. Then pain returned in a specific, recognizable form that the British Army eventually classified and named trench foot. In the first winter of the war, before the Army developed a response, tens of thousands of men were evacuated with this condition. Some lost toes, some lost feet. The standard treatment, once it was established, involved removing the boots and socks, rubbing the feet with whale oil, and elevating the legs. Officers were eventually ordered to inspect the feet of their men regularly and to ensure that whale oil was applied. This was a genuine tactical measure. The army could not afford to lose men to preventable foot damage when it was already losing men to everything else. The inspection of feet became routine. Whale oil became a standard issue item. The industrialization of foot care joined the industrialization of everything else. The rats that lived in the trenches were not a minor inconvenience. They were a constant, serious, large-scale presence. They fed on the food stores that were never perfectly secured. They fed on the bodies that were never perfectly retrieved. The space between the opposing trenches, the area called no man's land, was a place where the dead accumulated in quantities that made systematic recovery impossible. Men who had been killed going over the top, men who had been cut down in the wire, men who had been caught in the open by shell fire, lay where they fell for days, weeks, and in some sectors for much longer. The bodies decomposed. The rats fed. The rats grew large. Veterans describing the rats of the Western Front consistently used the same word. They were enormous, the size of cats. Some men wrote about waking in the night to find rats sitting on their chests or faces. Others wrote about the sounds the rats made moving through the trenches after dark, the rustling and scratching and fighting, the sheer density of their presence. Attempts to control them with terrier dogs, with traps, with poison, with shooting, had limited effect. The food supply they relied on, namely the dead, was not something the armies could eliminate. It was an endless supply. The lice were perhaps more universally present than even the rats. Every man in the trenches was lousy, every man without exception. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the hair, in the fabric of the skin after long enough exposure. They bit. They caused an itching, described variously as maddening, as constant, as something you eventually stopped fully noticing, even though you never stopped feeling it. Men would spend their rest periods going through their clothing seam by seam, running a candle flame along the inside of the shirt and trousers to kill the eggs. The sound of the eggs popping was described as a distinct, brief, cracking noise. This process was called chatting, and it was practiced communally, in groups, men sitting together in dugouts running their candles along their clothes and talking, the way people in other contexts might sit together doing other things. The procedure did not eliminate the lice, it reduced them temporarily. Within days they were back in full strength. The army eventually deployed mobile bathing units and delousing stations where men on rotation could strip, have their clothing baked or treated, and bathe in hot water. The hot water was described by men who received it as one of the most profound physical experiences of the war. Simply being clean. The experience was temporary. They went back to the trenches. The food that arrived at the front was not designed for nutrition in any sophisticated sense. It was designed to provide enough calories to keep men functional under conditions of extreme physical stress. The basic British ration in the trenches included bully beef, which was canned corned beef, hardtack biscuits hard enough to break teeth, tea, jam, and occasionally bread if the supply line could support its delivery. The system for getting hot food to men in the front-line trenches required that food be prepared well behind the lines, placed in containers, and carried forward through communication trenches that might stretch for miles, in the dark, under intermittent shell fire, by carrying parties who were themselves exhausted. Hot food arrived cold. Bread arrived stale. Items arrived damaged or not at all. Men supplemented their rations when possible through purchase at estaminets in the towns behind the lines during rest periods, through parcels sent from home, through foraging. But in the line, when the supply system broke down, which it did regularly, men ate bully beef cold, direct from the tin, with biscuits that required softening in water before they could be chewed without injury. This was not a failure of the supply system. This was the supply system performing within its normal tolerances. The management of the dead was one of the largest administrative challenges the armies of the First World War faced, and it was handled with a combination of genuine effort and bureaucratic inadequacy that is difficult to fully comprehend. In earlier wars, armies had largely buried their dead where they fell, or cremated them in mass pyres, or simply left them. World War I generated dead in quantities that previous wars had not approached, and generated them in ways that made recovery difficult. Artillery fire did not simply kill men, it obliterated them. Shells landing among groups of men could reduce those men to fragments distributed over an area too wide to fully recover. A direct hit on a man standing in a trench might leave nothing retrievable. A man buried by an explosion might be 3 feet underground in solid earth, with no surface indication of his location. The formal accounting of the dead required in theory that each man be identified, recorded, buried with a marked grave, and the location reported to the relevant headquarters so that the information could reach the casualty notification system and eventually the family. In practice, this worked partially and sporadically. The Graves Registration Commission, established by the British Army, employed men specifically tasked with following attacking forces, finding the dead, and recording them. They could not keep up. Nobody could keep up. By the end of the war, of the roughly 700,000 British and Commonwealth men killed, more than a third had no identified grave. They were recorded as having no known grave. That phrase, appearing on a notification letter arriving at a house in England or Australia or Canada, was the entire official account of a man's death and burial. He died somewhere. He is buried somewhere. We cannot tell you where. The smell of the Western Front was noted in almost every account written by men who served there. And it was not a single smell, but a layered accumulation of specific things. There was the smell of mud, which in the regions around Ypres had a specific character described as organic and thick and impossible to separate from the smell of the other things mixed into it. There was the smell of cordite from the explosions, a sharp chemical smell that hung in the air after bombardments. There was the smell of unwashed men in enclosed spaces, of clothing not changed for weeks, of bodies working under physical stress. There was the smell of latrines, which in well-organized positions were proper pits with seats and some screening, and in forward positions under fire were simply corners of the trench where men relieved themselves in the dark as quickly as possible. There was the smell of the dead. This is not something that can be adequately described through comparison. It is its own category. Men who encountered it for the first time wrote about it as something their bodies recognized before their minds could process it, something that triggered an involuntary physical response. After exposure over time, men adapted to it. It became background. It became the smell of where they were. When men came back from leave, returning from England or from the rear areas to the front, they reported smelling it from a significant distance before arriving. Their bodies, briefly cleaned, registered it again as an intrusion before adapting again. The smell of decomposition was the ambient smell of the front. It was simply where the front was. The rotation system that moved men in and out of the front line was essential to maintaining the armies as functional fighting forces, and it worked imperfectly in ways that were well understood by the armies and largely unaddressed. The basic concept was straightforward. Men could not remain in the front trenches indefinitely without breakdown. They needed to be withdrawn periodically to rest areas, given time to sleep normally, eat better food, clean themselves, and recover before returning. The British Army developed a rough rotation, typically involving 3 to 7 days in the front line, followed by time in support trenches, followed by time in reserve, followed by time in rest billets, before the cycle began again. The specific timing varied enormously by sector, by period of the war, and by operational demands. In quiet sectors, the rotation might proceed with some regularity. During major offensives, it collapsed entirely. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, some divisions were fed back into the fighting within days of being withdrawn from it. The concept of rest was operationally defined, which meant it was whatever time the army was not actively requiring men to perform combat tasks. It did not necessarily involve sleep. It did not necessarily involve safety. Men in rest billets were still subject to artillery fire if the billets were within range, which they frequently were. Rest was a category in the paperwork. Its relationship to actual physical recovery was inconsistently approximate. Sleep deprivation was so pervasive and so severe on the Western Front that it constitutes a separate category of suffering from the other physical conditions, and it received remarkably little formal attention from the armies concerned. The trench routine required that men stand to at dawn and at dusk, the two periods when attack was considered most likely. The rest of the night required sentries. The nights were not quiet, because artillery did not observe business hours and raids on enemy trenches were conducted in darkness, and working parties carrying supplies and repairing wire went out in darkness, and the enemy was doing all the same things. Men assigned to fatigue duties carrying rations and ammunition and engineer stores through communication trenches might spend the entirety of the night in exhausting physical labor and be expected to stand to at dawn. Men assigned to sentry duty stood in the cold, watching darkness for hours. Men not on official duty tried to sleep in shelters that were frequently too small, too cold, too wet, or too loud. Men suffering from the constant physical irritation of lice could not sleep through the itching. Men with acute anxiety could not sleep through the anxiety. The normal average sleep available to a man in the front line during active periods may have been 3 or 4 hours out of 24, and that sleep was not consolidated, but fragmented, interrupted, partial. Chronic sleep deprivation over weeks and months produces specific cognitive effects. Judgment degrades. Reaction time slows. Emotional regulation fails. Concentration becomes difficult. Memory becomes unreliable. Many of the behaviors that were later attributed to cowardice or lack of moral fiber in soldiers of the First World War were in fact the predictable cognitive consequences of extended sleep deprivation operating in combination with other stressors. This was understood by some medical officers at the time. It was not reflected in the official frameworks for evaluating soldier behavior. The medical response to psychological breakdown during the First World War moved through several phases, and the movement between those phases tells a story about how institutions process inconvenient realities when those realities become operationally unavoidable. At the beginning of the war, the official position of the British Army, broadly shared across the major armies involved, was that psychiatric breakdown in combat reflected personal weakness, cowardice, or moral failure. A man who could no longer function was simply a man who would not function. The diagnosis was not medical, it was moral. The response was disciplinary. Men showing signs of severe psychological disturbance might be charged with cowardice, with desertion, with malingering. The penalty for cowardice in the field was death, and it was applied. 266 British soldiers were executed by their own army during the First World War, the majority for desertion or cowardice. The medical community could not be entirely excluded from these cases. Medical officers were required to certify that men were fit to be shot. Some refused. Others signed the certifications. The record on this is uneven, and in many cases was not preserved in ways that allow full reconstruction. The condition that eventually forced a change in the official framework was not a new phenomenon, but an old one that appeared in quantities the army could not absorb into its existing categories. Shell shock. The term was coined in 1915 by Charles Myers, a British psychologist serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps, and it described a constellation of symptoms that appeared in men following exposure to artillery bombardment. Tremors, inability to speak, blindness with no physical cause, paralysis with no physical cause, amnesia, uncontrollable weeping, inability to walk, night terrors severe enough to prevent any sleep at all, flashbacks and intrusive memories that recurred involuntarily with the sensory intensity of the original experience. The men presenting these symptoms were not performing. The symptoms were real. They were also, critically, rendering men completely incapable of military function. And they were appearing in numbers the army could not simply court-martial its way through. By 1917, shell shock cases accounted for a significant portion of British military hospital admissions. The army had to develop a medical response or lose a substantial fraction of its combat-effective strength to men sitting in hospitals unable to speak or walk. The response it developed was shaped inevitably by institutional priorities. The primary goal was not the welfare of the men. The primary goal was return to duty. Treatment methods were evaluated not for their effectiveness in actually resolving the psychological damage, but for their effectiveness in returning men to the line. The most influential treatment framework was developed by a British physician named Lewis Yelland, who used electrical stimulation, meaning electrical shocks applied to affected body parts, combined with authoritarian suggestion, meaning direct commands delivered in a clinical setting that the symptoms would cease, to produce the disappearance of physical symptoms in men with hysterical paralysis or mutism. The symptoms did frequently disappear under Yelland's approach. The men often did return to duty. What happened to them afterward, what they carried, what the underlying damage was not a question the military medical system was designed to pursue. The goal was not healing. The goal was return to function. The use of poison gas in the First World War represents a specific case study in how quickly a practice considered universally unacceptable can become normalized within the administrative logic of an ongoing conflict. The German army first used chlorine gas in a large-scale attack at Ypres in April 1915, releasing approximately 150 tons of chlorine from cylinders along a 4-mile front. The gas traveled on the wind toward the Allied trenches. The troops in those trenches had no masks, no experience with gas, no protocols. The accounts from survivors describe a yellow-green cloud moving toward them at ground level, smelling of bleach, followed by the realization of what it was, followed by the inability to do anything effective about it, followed by men dying in large numbers as the chlorine destroyed the tissue lining their airways. Roughly 1,000 men died in that attack. 2,000 more were incapacitated. The Allied reaction to this event was not primarily moral. It was operational. The Germans had a weapon that worked. The appropriate response was to develop the same weapon. Within months, the British Army had conducted its own chlorine attack. The French followed. The development of gas warfare proceeded on all sides, with the logic of an arms race. Chlorine was followed by phosgene, which was more effective and harder to detect because it did not have the distinctive yellow-green color. Phosgene was responsible for the majority of gas deaths of the war. Then came mustard gas, which was not primarily a killing agent, but a casualty-producing agent. Mustard gas attacked the exposed skin, the eyes, the respiratory tract. It caused severe blistering that could last for weeks. It contaminated the ground and equipment and clothing it landed on, creating hazards that persisted long after the initial attack. It blinded men temporarily or permanently. It did not need to kill to take men out of the fight. A man with severely blistered skin and swollen shut eyes could not fight and required considerable medical resources to treat. Mustard gas was, from a purely operational standpoint, highly effective. Both sides used it extensively in 1917 and 1918. The gas mask, which began as a simple pad of cotton soaked in bicarbonate solution held over the face, evolved rapidly into a more sophisticated device, but never became fully reliable under the conditions of the front. Men wearing box respirators, the standard British gas mask by late 1916, experienced restricted breathing, fogged eyepieces, and the claustrophobic sensation of having one's face enclosed in rubber. Fitting was critical. A poorly fitted mask leaked. In a gas attack, a leak was lethal. Drills were conducted constantly to ensure men could don their masks in the required time of less than 10 seconds. Men were tested and retested. And still men died in gas attacks because their masks did not seal properly, because the attack came while they were sleeping, because they were in positions the gas concentrated in, because the masks were damaged in ways not visible during inspection. The official cause of death in those cases was recorded in the same administrative language as all the others. Killed in action. The standard mechanism for most deaths on the Western Front was artillery. The statistics on this point are consistent across the major armies. Artillery caused between 50 and 60% of all casualties, depending on the period of the war and the army under consideration. This fact tends to get less narrative attention than the machine gun, perhaps because machine gun fire is more cinematically legible, or perhaps because there is an agent that can be identified when a man is shot. Artillery simply arrives. It arrives with a sound that veterans described consistently as a specific tonal progression, a distant thud of firing, a rushing sound as the shell travels, and then either a detonation that is survived or one that is not. Men who spent enough time under artillery fire developed a sensitivity to that sound that was both useful and permanent. They could read the type of shell, estimate the likely landing point, assess the danger of any given inbound round. They could be wrong. The shells were not consistent, the trajectories were not perfectly predictable, and the volume of fire delivered by both sides during major bombardments was such that individual assessment was irrelevant. During the preliminary bombardment for the Battle of the Somme, the British fired approximately 1.5 million shells over 7 days. The intent was to destroy the German defensive positions and kill the defenders so thoroughly that the infantry assault that followed would face minimal resistance. The infantry assault that followed faced enormous resistance because the shells had not done what they were supposed to do, because the German dugouts were deep enough that many men survived the bombardment, because the fuses on a significant portion of the shells were defective, because the shells themselves were sometimes defective. On the first day of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties. 19,000 of those men were dead by the end of the day. The planning for the Somme was not incompetent in the sense of being poorly executed according to its own logic. It was a rational application of the doctrine and the resources available to the commanders responsible for it. The problem was that the doctrine and the resources were not sufficient for the task. This distinction matters. The tendency to explain the First World War through individual incompetence, through the stupidity of generals, through the failures of specific men, misses the deeper structure. The system was the problem. The industrial capacity to kill had outpaced the industrial capacity to protect. The machine gun, the artillery piece, the barbed wire, all on defense, had created a tactical situation in which there was no good solution available at the operational level. Every option open to commanders resulted in large casualties. Some options resulted in slightly fewer large casualties than others. The men who chose the options that resulted in the larger casualties were not necessarily stupider than the men who chose the better options. They were working within the same system, with the same information and the same constraints. The experience of going over the top, the assault from the trench, was not uniform across the war. The popular image of men climbing out of the trench in broad daylight and walking slowly across no man's land toward German machine guns is drawn specifically from the experience of the first day of the Somme, and it represents a particular tactical doctrine, one that assumed the preliminary bombardment would have so thoroughly suppressed the defense that movement at walking pace would be safer than the alternative of running, which could cause units to lose formation and mix together in ways that would make them hard to control. That doctrine proved catastrophically wrong on July 1st, 1916. Over the course of the war, tactics evolved significantly. Infantry learned to use cover, to advance in smaller groups, to develop the techniques of fire and movement in which some men fire to keep the enemy's heads down, while other men advance. The army that fought in 1918 was tactically more sophisticated than the army that fought in 1914 or 1915 or even 1916. The learning was genuine. It was also purchased in the currency of the men who died while the army figured out what it was doing wrong. The experience of the men who actually climbed out of the trench, however the tactical doctrine specified they should move, was one of profound physical terror operating in combination with the social pressure of proximity to other men and the requirement to continue moving. Fear under fire is a physical experience. The body responds to threat with adrenal responses that are not fully under conscious control. Breathing accelerates. Hearing changes, with some sounds becoming abnormally loud and others disappearing. Time perception distorts. Men under intense fire reported the experience of time slowing down, of noticing individual details with extraordinary clarity, of the space between events stretching out. Others reported memory gaps, the inability to recall sequences of events that they had clearly experienced. The mental state of a man in the middle of an assault, moving across ground, being swept by machine gun fire, with shells landing around him, with men near him being killed and wounded, was not a state in which rational decision-making was functioning normally. It was a state in which the body was operating on training and instinct and proximity to the movement of other bodies. If the men around you kept going forward, you kept going forward. If they stopped, you stopped. The social cohesion of small units was the primary mechanism by which forward movement was maintained under those conditions, and it was the loss of that cohesion, when too many men in a group had been killed, that caused the collapse of attacks at the unit level. The treatment of prisoners taken in the First World War varied enormously by context, and does not yield to simple summary. The formal conventions governing prisoner treatment existed and were generally observed in the context of large numbers of prisoners captured and processed through formal channels. German prisoner of war camps held roughly 200,000 British prisoners at various points, and the conditions in those camps varied from tolerable to brutal depending on the period of the war and the type of work prisoners were assigned to. Britain held comparable numbers of German prisoners, and the conditions in British camps were also variable. What happened to men taken in the immediate context of combat, in the minutes following their capture, was a different matter, and followed rules that had no formal expression in any convention. Prisoner-taking required the willingness to stop fighting and accept the vulnerability of surrender on one side, and the willingness to accept surrender rather than kill on the other. Both of those things were sometimes absent. The evidence in memoirs and diaries from all sides records incidents of men being killed after surrendering. It records incidents of men being killed while surrendering. It records the specific problem of wounded men who could not effectively indicate their surrender being killed because in the chaos of combat their incapacity was not legible. The official position of every army was that prisoners should be taken and treated correctly. The practice was something else, and the something else was understood to exist and was not officially acknowledged. The military medical system of the First World War was a genuine and complex organization that moved wounded men from the point of injury through a series of care levels, each designed to perform a specific function. The sequence was regimental aid post, casualty clearing station, base hospital, and finally for men requiring extended treatment, hospitals in Britain or in other theatre rear areas. The logic was that men who could be quickly patched and returned to duty should be, and men who required longer treatment should be moved back to release capacity at the forward positions. The system moved enormous numbers of men. In the period around major offensives, it moved numbers that exceeded its designed capacity. The Battle of Passchendaele, fought in the autumn of 1917 under conditions of particularly severe mud, produced casualties who could not be moved efficiently because the evacuation routes were themselves in the mud. Stretcher bearers carrying wounded men through mud that in some areas was knee-deep or deeper, following paths through ground churned by months of artillery fire, required hours to move a casualty, a distance that in normal conditions would take minutes. Men wounded in the assault and unable to move independently could wait many hours for evacuation. Some sank into the mud before evacuation reached them. This is documented not as atrocity, but as operational difficulty. The word used in official reports was conditions. Triage, the medical practice of sorting casualties by severity and treatability in order to allocate limited medical resources most effectively, was practiced on the Western Front and developed considerable sophistication over the course of the war. The fundamental triage categories divided wounded men into those who could survive only with immediate treatment, those who could wait, and those who could not survive regardless of treatment. The men in that third category were labeled, given morphine where it was available, and set aside. They would die, and treating them would consume resources that could be used to save men in the second category. This was rational under the constraints available. The men doing the labeling were medical professionals acting under enormous pressure in conditions that did not allow for the kind of care they had been trained to provide. The moral reality of sitting a living, conscious man against a wall and marking him as not to be treated. The moral reality of doing that again and again over the course of a major action. The moral reality of those men sometimes looking at you and understanding what the label meant was something that the medical system did not provide any framework for processing. It simply required that it be done. Amputation rates for the First World War were extremely high by the standards of later wars, and they reflected both the nature of the wounds produced by artillery and the limitations of the available medical interventions. A shell wound to a limb typically involved not just the direct trauma of the fragment, but contamination with the material the shell had passed through, which on the Western Front typically included soil that had been occupied by men and animals, and the decomposing matter associated with both for 4 years. The bacterial load in that soil was enormous. Gas gangrene, the infection of wound tissue by anaerobic bacteria that were prevalent in the heavily contaminated soil of the front, was a rapid and lethal process. A wound that became infected with gas gangrene could progress to a life-threatening systemic infection within hours. The available response was amputation before the infection could spread. The success rate of the amputations depended on how quickly they were performed after injury, which depended on how quickly the man could be evacuated to a surgical facility, which depended on the conditions. In the worst scenarios, men arrived at casualty clearing stations with infections already advanced beyond the point where amputation could help. They died of sepsis, in pain, in a hospital rather than on the field. The administrative records noted this as died of wounds, which was a different category from killed in action, and which affected the pension calculations for the family in ways that were not always to the family's benefit. The British pension system for disabled veterans and for the families of men killed during the First World War was an administrative structure built on assumptions about the correct level of support that varied significantly from any assessment a modern observer would make. Men who returned from the war with severe physical or psychiatric disabilities found themselves navigating a system that required them to prove the degree of their incapacity repeatedly, that categorized disabilities on scales designed to translate human suffering into monetary equivalents, and that provided benefits at levels that left many former soldiers in significant poverty. The Ministry of Pensions, established in 1916 to manage the increasing caseload, dealt with 2.5 million pension claims by the armistice. The evaluation of claims required medical assessments conducted by medical boards that were not neutral bodies, but were partly structured to manage the financial exposure of the government. Men found ways to game the system because the stakes were survival. The system found ways to deny claims because the aggregate cost of fully meeting all legitimate claims would have been politically unsupportable. The men who had been most severely psychologically damaged were in the worst position because the evidence of their condition was the least legible to a medical board looking for objectively measurable deficits. The particular position of officers in the First World War trench system was not the position typically rendered in accounts that focus on class privilege and safe distances. The reality was considerably more complicated. Junior officers, second lieutenants and lieutenants commanding platoons were required to lead their men in attacks and to be present in the front line in ways that senior officers were not. The casualty rate for junior infantry officers was higher than for the men they commanded. They were expected to go first over the top, partly for practical reasons of leading from the front, and partly because it was understood that men needed to see their officers doing what was expected of them before they would do it themselves. The average life expectancy of a junior officer in the infantry during active operations was measured in weeks. This was known. It was documented. Young men of officer class who were commissioned and sent to France in 1916 and 1917 were not under any significant illusion that they were likely to survive. Some officers wrote about this directly in their letters and diaries. Some did not write about it because the knowledge was too present to require articulation. They went anyway, because the social and military structure they existed within did not provide a framework for not going, because the men in their platoons needed to see them going, because the alternative to going was a court-martial and the specific shame of having visibly refused. The mechanisms of coercion and social pressure that produced forward movement in the assault operated on officers as on enlisted men, with the specific addition that officers' social standing was more completely identified with military performance and military courage in ways that made refusal even less available as an option. The communication between the front and the rear, in both the military and the civilian senses, was heavily managed, and the management became more systematic as the war continued. Military censorship of letters home was standard practice from early in the war. Letters written by soldiers were collected and read by officers or censors before being forwarded. Content referring to unit location, to the progress of specific operations, to casualty levels, to the specific conditions of the trenches, was removed, or the letter was returned to the writer with instructions to remove it. Men developed forms of communication with family members at home, private codes, references that would be opaque to a censor but interpretable by the recipient, ways of conveying information about their condition and location without naming those things directly. The censorship shaped the picture of the war available to the civilian population in Britain and in other countries involved. The picture available at home was of men in difficult but manageable conditions, enduring hardship with the spirit appropriate to the occasion, sometimes noting their tiredness or their hope for an end, but rarely conveying the full texture of what they were living in. The government also managed the news. The press was restricted in its access to the front, and dispatches from the few accredited correspondents who had access were subject to censorship before publication. The picture in the newspapers was more heroic and less immediate than the picture available in private letters. The picture in the private letters was less complete than the full experience. The full experience was not communicated at all. The specific experience of the men who survived the war and returned to civilian life, the men who came back, is a subject that the victory narrative of the First World War absorbed incompletely and uneasily. The language available for talking about what had happened was inadequate. The social structures available for processing what had happened were inadequate. Men who came back from the trenches to ordinary lives in England or France or Germany or Australia found themselves in the presence of people who had not been there and who had no framework for understanding what had been there. Some men talked about it extensively and found that talking did not transfer the experience in any meaningful way, that the words they had available described events without communicating the atmosphere in which those events had occurred. Others found that they could not talk about it at all, that the experience had created something inside them that language could not reach, that their silence was not reluctance, but incapacity. The families of men who came back encountered veterans who were physically present, but psychologically altered in ways that could not be fully explained or addressed. Marriages under stress. Children frightened by fathers who woke screaming or who disappeared into some interior space at unexpected moments. Employers encountering men whose concentration had been permanently affected. The pensions and medical resources available to men with ongoing psychological difficulties were, as already noted, inadequate. The prevalence of alcohol in the management of the war experience, both during and after, was pervasive and largely unaddressed as a problem in the official framework. Rum was issued as a standard ration in the British Army, particularly before actions, particularly in extreme cold. The rum ration was not a trivial amount. It was understood to be a tool for reducing the acute anxiety preceding attacks to levels that allowed men to function. It worked. It also meant that the British Army regularly sent men over the top with alcohol in their systems. The self-medication with alcohol that continued for many veterans after the war. The rates of alcohol-related problems among veterans of the First World War that become visible in the social records of the 1920s and 1930s were not something the systems established to care for veterans were designed to address. They were not categorized as war-related conditions by the pension apparatus. They were personal failures. The experience of the men from the British Empire, the soldiers from India, from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand, from South Africa, from the West Indies, from East Africa, who served in the First World War, was shaped by the same physical conditions as the British men alongside them, with the addition of further layers of complexity that the official histories of the war dealt with only partially. The Anzac reputation, established at Gallipoli and maintained on the Western Front, was in many respects genuine, reflecting the specific character of men from a less socially stratified military tradition. It was also constructed, managed, and deployed in ways that served recruitment and morale purposes in Australia and New Zealand. The Indian soldiers who served on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915, who provided a significant portion of the fighting strength of the British Expeditionary Force in the critical first year before the volunteer armies arrived in numbers, appear in the official histories in substantially less detail than their numbers and contributions warrant. The men from the West Indies who served in various capacities, primarily in labor and support roles rather than combat, received treatment from the military system that reflected the racial hierarchies of the empire in ways that had specific, material effects on their lives during and after service. The question of what the men of the First World War knew and believed about the war they were fighting, as distinct from what they were told, is one of the more difficult questions in the historical record. The evidence is extensive but uneven, concentrated in the experiences of men who were literate, who wrote, whose writing survived, whose writing was eventually made available to researchers. The picture that emerges from that evidence suggests that the gap between the official representation of the war and the experience of the men fighting it was understood by those men from a relatively early point, and that the understanding was managed through a combination of dark humor, specific forms of ironic communication, and a pragmatic acceptance that the gap would not be closed. Soldiers did not uniformly hate their commanders. They did not uniformly oppose the war. The evidence for both widespread and genuine opposition within the fighting ranks is limited. What is more consistent is a specific form of bitter realism, an understanding that the systems operating on them were indifferent to them as individuals, that their lives were being spent as currency in a transaction they could not influence, and that survival within that transaction required a particular kind of internal adjustment. The adjustment involved continuing to function. It involved continuing to do what was required. It involved not thinking too much about certain things. The Christmas truce of 1914, the informal ceasefire in parts of the Western Front on Christmas Day, and in some areas for several days before and after, during which men from opposing sides emerged from their trenches and met in no man's land, exchanged food and tobacco, and in some famous instances played football, has become one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for the human capacity to resist dehumanization, even in the worst conditions. It is cited correctly. It happened. It was real. It was also an event that the high commands on both sides worked to prevent from recurring and largely succeeded. In subsequent Christmas periods, artillery fire was maintained specifically to prevent a repetition. The truce of 1914 was not a sign that the war could have been otherwise. It was an event that the war's institutional structure identified as a threat to operational continuity and suppressed. The fact that men could meet in no man's land and recognize each other as human beings was not a discovery that produced any change in the system. The system required that they not meet. From 1915 onward, they largely did not meet. The bureaucratic record of the First World War is one of the largest and most detailed administrative archives in human history. The British National Archives holds dozens of miles of shelving with material from the war diaries from every unit, casualty returns, medical records, court-martial proceedings, pension files, official correspondence, intelligence summaries, logistics records, engineering reports. The German archives, though significantly damaged in the Second World War, are also extensive. The French archives, the records of the Commonwealth forces. Together they constitute an administrative record of an event of almost incomprehensible scale, produced by systems that continued to function, to file, to record, to categorize, to calculate, throughout 4 years of sustained mass death. The forms were filled in, the returns were submitted, the categories were maintained. The system produced its documentation in the same methodical rhythm, whether the events being documented were extraordinary or routine, whether the men filling out the forms had watched the men they were documenting die an hour earlier or had never met them. The administrative continuity is itself a kind of testament to the nature of the war. The system did not break down emotionally. It did not stop to reflect. It continued to produce its paperwork. The paperwork is what remains. The landscape of the Western Front today, more than 100 years after the war ended, still shows the physical evidence of what happened there. The ground in areas of heavy fighting has not fully returned to its pre-war contour. The craters of the larger mines, blown beneath enemy positions at moments like the opening of the Somme, are visible as shallow depressions in fields. Soil turned and churned by artillery fire has a different character from undisturbed ground, and in some areas still moves in ways that indicate the continued presence of shells that did not detonate. A significant proportion of the shells fired in the First World War were duds, shells with defective fuses that did not explode when they landed. They remain in the ground. Farmers in Belgium and northern France find them regularly during ploughing. There is a procedure for their disposal. Occasionally they detonate. The iron harvest, as it is called, continues to yield several hundred tons of unexploded ordnance per year from Belgian fields alone. Some of that ordnance still contains functional gas. The war did not end. It only stopped being administered. The bureaucracy closed its files. The ground retained what it was given. And the dead who have no known grave remain wherever the system lost track of them, which was everywhere, which was the logical conclusion of a war that had found, over 4 years of careful organization, that the most efficient approach to the problem of the dead was to stop counting them individually and count them instead as a category, as a quantity, as a figure in a column that would later appear in histories as the aggregate cost of what had been in every formal document produced by every government involved, a necessary and correctly administered undertaking.